On the morning of April 14, 1912, the largest moving object built by human hands carried close to 2,200 people across a calm stretch of the North Atlantic, 4 days out of Southampton and roughly halfway to New York. Close to 900 of these passengers held first-class tickets, just under 600 held second-class tickets, and more than 700 held the cheapest fare the White Star Line sold, the fare known at the time as third class or steerage. None of these passengers woke up that day suspecting it would be their last full day at sea. But the way each of them would spend that ordinary Sunday morning, hour by hour, had already been decided days earlier, the moment they purchased a ticket and were assigned a deck. So how exactly did one ship organize a single morning into 3 almost entirely separate experiences, all unfolding at the same time, inside the same hull? By that Sunday, the Titanic was on her 4th full day at sea, the 4th round of a routine the crew themselves were still learning since this was the ship's maiden voyage. Life on board ran on what was called ship's time, not the time of any port behind or ahead of her. Each night, close to midnight, officers in the chart room set the ship's clocks back by a number of minutes, calculated from how far west the vessel had traveled that day, so that the following noon would still align with the sun directly overhead. On the 2 previous days, the ship's run had been logged at 484 and then 519 nautical miles, and that coming midnight, the scheduled adjustment was 47 minutes, divided into 2 smaller corrections on either side of the hour. It was a routine, technical task that almost nobody on the passenger decks ever had reason to notice. Long before any passenger stirred, large sections of the ship were already fully staffed and working, in places passengers rarely saw. Down in the boiler rooms, firemen and trimmers worked 4-hour watches around the clock, since the furnaces that powered the ship needed to stay lit and pressurized at all times and could not be shut down and restarted on short notice. On the open decks above, members of the deck crew were already out before sunrise hosing down and scrubbing the wooden planking, a routine repeated every single morning of the crossing, regardless of which class of passenger would later walk across it. Of the roughly 885 crew members aboard, the majority were not sailors at all, but stewards, cooks, stokers, and engineers, split into 3 departments: deck, engine, and what was called victualling, the department responsible for feeding and serving everyone above them in the ship's hierarchy. Crew breakfast was simple and consistent, regardless of rank below officer level, typically oatmeal and tea, eaten quickly before the working day properly began. For the stewards assigned to first class, the working day began well before dawn. Each first-class stateroom was fitted with an electric call button wired to an indicator board in the steward's pantry, a system that told a steward exactly which cabin needed attention without anyone walking the corridor to check. Bedroom stewards filled cans with hot water for washing, since not every first-class cabin had its own bathroom. Although the Titanic carried an unusually high ratio of private bathrooms to passengers for a ship of her era, linen was changed daily in every class, even though there was no laundry on board. Sheets, towels, and tablecloths were collected, stored, and sent out to be washed only once the ship reached port. A steward could also have a passenger's shoes polished or a suit pressed for a small fee, the items left quietly outside the cabin door overnight and returned before morning. A first-class lady on board was expected to change clothing several times across a single day, much as she would have at home: a morning dress for breakfast and the early hours, a tailored costume for walking the deck, something lighter for lunch, a tea gown for the late afternoon, and a formal evening gown, with jewelry to match, for dinner. Several personal maids were traveling on board with their employers, and it was their job to lay out each outfit at the correct hour and help a woman dress, since the layers, fastenings, and pinned hairstyles of the period were not designed to be managed without assistance. The fashionable corset of 1912 alone required another set of hands. Its laces ran up the back rather than the front, a feature that quietly marked the wearer's social standing, since only a woman with a maid, or at the very least a sister or a friend, to pull and tie those laces each morning could wear one at all. A first-class gentleman was expected to appear at dinner in a white tie, although mornings allowed for a noticeably more relaxed standard, with a tweed suit or a lounge jacket considered perfectly acceptable for breakfast and the deck. One level down, In terms of both physical location and price, second-class passengers were waking to a more modest but still comfortable morning. Second-class cabins had oak paneling, mahogany furniture, and a fold-away basin known as a compactum, which had to be filled and drained manually by a steward rather than connected to running water. Single men and single women were generally placed in separate shared cabins, even when traveling with relatives, since mixed unmarried sleeping arrangements were not considered proper at the time. Second class still received a daily linen change and a steward's morning knock, but there was no question of breakfast served in the room. Second-class passengers dressed and walked to their own dining saloon for the meal, the same as everyone outside the wealthiest cabins on board. Further along, in the parts of the ship furthest from the public rooms above, third-class passengers were waking inside small but private cabins, a detail that set White Star Line ships apart from many competitors, where the cheapest fare still meant an open dormitory shared among strangers. Third class on the Titanic offered cabins for 2, 4, 6, or more people, fitted with bunks that had mattresses, pillows, and blankets, although passengers were expected to bring their own sheets, something most emigrant families traveling permanently to America had already packed for the journey. Only 2 bathtubs served more than 700 third-class passengers between them, so most people washed at a basin inside their own cabin instead. Stewards moved along a long passageway nicknamed Scotland Road, after a well-known street in Liverpool, knocking on third-class doors to mark the start of the day. A gate separated third-class corridors from the rest of the ship, required not by custom but by United States immigration law, which insisted that steerage passengers be kept apart from other classes to limit the spread of disease and simplify processing once the ship reached New York. Crossing into another class's section of the ship without a specific reason was simply not permitted. Breakfast was served between 8 and 10 in the morning in all 3 dining saloons, although what arrived on the plate, and the room it arrived in, depended entirely on the fare paid. In first class, breakfast was the most relaxed meal of the day, offering a wide menu of hot and cold dishes to choose from, rather than the long fixed sequence of courses reserved for dinner. One deck below, second-class passengers ate in a dining saloon finished in white-painted oak paneling with colored linoleum underfoot, and mahogany swivel chairs bolted to the floor. Modest by comparison with first class, but considered handsome by the standards of any other line's second class at the time. Their breakfast was heartier and more traditionally British, often including smoked herrings, ox kidneys, bacon, eggs, 3 different preparations of potato, hominy, Vienna and Graham rolls, soda scones, buckwheat cakes, and a selection of jams, with watercress standing in as the only vegetable on the table. Third-class breakfast on this particular Sunday, the 14th of April, consisted of oatmeal with milk, smoked herrings, jacket potatoes, ham and eggs, fresh bread and butter, marmalade, Swedish bread, and tea or coffee. A meal that, measured against what many of these passengers had been used to at home, counted as generous rather than basic. None of the food on board in any class was rationed. The ship carried enormous quantities of nearly everything, since running short in the middle of the ocean was simply not an option White Star could afford. Somewhere between breakfast and the late morning, first-class passengers in the smoking room could pick up a copy of the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, a short newspaper produced on board overnight and printed by a crew member officially listed as Printer Steward. It carried stock prices, race results, and general news items collected through the ship's wireless apparatus, along with the next day's menus, giving passengers in the most expensive cabins something resembling an ordinary morning paper despite being in the middle of the Atlantic. There was no equivalent publication in second or third class. The bulletin would never get the chance to report on the one event that would make this particular crossing remembered above every other White Star sailing. For passengers willing to pay an additional fee, the ship's Marconi room offered another way to fill a morning: a personal telegram, sent to family or business contacts on either side of the ocean, and relayed through the wireless operators on duty. As the Titanic moved further from Europe and closer to the American coast, more shore stations came within range, and the volume of these personal messages grew accordingly. The 2 operators on board, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, spent much of that Sunday working through this backlog of paid passenger traffic, a detail that mattered little at the time, but would later be remembered for an entirely different reason: once it became clear how much wireless business was competing for their attention that day. Letters worked on a slower schedule than telegrams, but they were no less a part of the ship's daily business. The initials in the ship's full name, RMS Titanic, stood for Royal Mail Steamer, a designation that meant the vessel sailed under contract to carry mail for the British and American postal services, not simply as a passenger liner that happened to have a post office. 5 seapost clerks, 3 American and 2 British, worked long shifts in a sorting room on G-deck, processing a cargo of roughly 3,400 mail sacks bound for addresses across the United States, alongside whatever letters passengers themselves dropped off to be posted on arrival. None of those clerks held first, second, or third-class tickets in the usual sense. They were specialists, employed separately from the rest of the crew, with their own berths and their own dining table, there purely to keep several million individual pieces of mail moving toward New York on schedule. Once breakfast had been cleared away, first-class passengers who wanted exercise could book a slot in the gymnasium, supervised by the ship's physical instructor, T.W. Macaulay, who showed passengers how to use mechanical rowing machines, a stationary cycling machine, and an electric horse and electric camel, built to imitate the motion of riding without an actual animal. Gymnasium time, like the Turkish bath and the squash court one deck below, where a professional was also on hand to give lessons or play a practice match, was divided by sex and booked by appointment, so that men and women rarely used the equipment during the same hour. The Turkish bath itself, reached through the same corridor as the swimming pool, was decorated in a Moorish style with blue-green tiles, carved teak paneling, and a marble drinking fountain, and offered a hot room, a temperate room, and a cooling room furnished with wicker recliners. The pool nearby, heated and filled with a mixture of fresh and salt water, measured 30 feet by 14. Passengers less interested in exercise could instead sit in the library or the reading and writing room, finishing correspondence or simply reading, or visit the barber shop on C-deck for a morning shave and haircut, a room that doubled as a small souvenir shop selling postcards and trinkets stamped with the ship's name. Anyone who preferred to skip the included dining saloon altogether could pay separately to eat in the à la carte restaurant, nicknamed the Ritz, where a menu designed in the style of the most fashionable London restaurants was served at whatever hours suited the diner rather than at a fixed sitting. A short distance from the gymnasium, on the same level, a small kennel held a dozen or so dogs belonging to first-class passengers, looked after under the supervision of the ship's carpenter, and exercised once a day on the open deck toward the stern, sometimes by a steward or bellboy, and sometimes by the owners themselves. Several of the dog owners on board had already agreed to enter their animals into an informal dog show planned for the morning of April 15th, the kind of small shipboard amusement organized to fill an otherwise uneventful day near the end of a long crossing. Smaller lapdogs were often kept quietly in their owners' cabins instead, against the rules, but rarely challenged by the stewards who noticed them. For passengers who preferred fresh air, deck stewards rented out wooden deck chairs and wrapped passengers in steamer rugs against the wind, and a brisk walk around the enclosed promenade, often called taking a constitutional, was considered both fashionable and good for the figure, since the rich, heavy meals served on board left little room for a woman to stay slim without some form of daily exercise. A first-class lady, however, was not free to take that walk with just any gentleman who offered his arm. Walking the deck alone with a man who was neither a relative nor her husband, even briefly and even in plain daylight, was the kind of detail other passengers noticed and repeated over lunch, and a reputation built over a lifetime could be damaged by a single, careless afternoon in the wrong company. Second-class passengers had their own, smaller promenade deck and a library where they could read or write letters, while third-class recreation centered on an open well deck toward the bow and a general room furnished entirely with wooden benches instead of upholstery, a deliberate choice repeated across the White Star Fleet, specifically to keep lice from settling into fabric that would be difficult to clean thoroughly between voyages. At 10:30, the morning took its one clearly scheduled turn. Instead of the routine Sunday inspection of the ship, Captain Edward Smith led an interdenominational worship service in the first-class dining saloon, a duty that fell to a ship's master whenever no chaplain had been assigned to the crossing. According to Colonel Archibald Gracie, One of the passengers present, the congregation sang the hymn, "O God, Our Help in Ages Past," and the service ran until roughly 11:15. A separate service was held later that day for second-class passengers, where, according to some accounts, the hymn, "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," a hymn closely associated with sailors and the sea, was sung instead. A muster of the crew at their lifeboat stations had also been scheduled for 11 o'clock that same morning, but it never took place. Lookout Archie Jewell later testified that a strong wind was the reason. Other accounts suggest the timing simply clashed with the captain's church service. Whatever the true cause, the muster was never rescheduled before the day was over. Just before noon, the ship's deck officers gathered on the bridge wing with their sextants to take what was called the noon sight, measuring the sun's position to fix the Titanic's exact location and calculate the previous 24 hours' run. That day's figure, once posted, would read 546 nautical miles, the fastest run of the crossing so far. This single measurement, repeated daily on every transatlantic crossing of the period, determined how far the clocks would be set back at the coming midnight, and it marked the formal end of one ship's day and the start of the next, regardless of what any calendar on land might say. For passengers, noon brought little change beyond a shift in mood and appetite. First-class lunch service began at 12:30 in the main dining saloon, or, for those who preferred something lighter, at the Café Parisien on B deck, a smaller room serving sandwiches and tea with an open view over the water. It was during this exact stretch of the day, while deck chairs filled the promenade and stewards carried trays past polished wood paneling, that the morning's only genuine warning of what lay ahead was arriving in pieces, largely unnoticed by the passengers walking those decks. At 9:12 that morning, the Cunard liner Caronia had already sent a wireless report of icebergs, smaller fragments of ice known as growlers, and field ice along the Titanic's intended path. The message reached the bridge and was logged. Shortly afterward, a further report relayed through the Caronia from the Dutch liner Noordam added more detail about the same patch of ice somewhat further along the route. At 1:42 in the afternoon, the White Star liner Baltic radioed a report of large quantities of field ice, with exact coordinates attached, and this message reached Captain Smith directly. Smith read it, then handed it to J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, who was traveling on board as a passenger. Ismay reportedly placed the message in his coat pocket rather than returning it to the bridge straight away. 3 minutes later, at 1:45, the liner America sent word of 2 large icebergs sighted directly along the shipping lane, a message intended for the hydrographic office in Washington, but relayed through the Titanic's own wireless room on its way there. None of these warnings changed the ship's course in any noticeable way, and none reduced her speed, which stayed close to 22 knots through the entire afternoon. Passengers dressing for lunch that day had no reason to notice anything unusual about the sea ahead of them. If anything, the weather was improving by the hour, the brisk wind of the morning settling into the kind of still, clear calm that made the whole day feel, to almost everyone aboard, like the finest the crossing had offered so far. By the time lunch service ended in all 3 dining saloons that afternoon, the morning's one public event, the captain's church service, was already 2 hours behind the ship. The noon sight had already fixed the day's position in the log, and 3 separate wireless warnings about ice were sitting, variously on the bridge, in the chart room, and inside a White Star Line chairman's coat pocket. None of this had changed anything a passenger could feel in the ordinary pace of the day. Stewards were still polishing brass fittings along the staircase. The gymnasium's mechanical horse was still booked out in half-hour blocks through the early afternoon. And somewhere in the chart room, an officer had already worked out that the night's clocks would need to go back 47 minutes to stay aligned with the sun, the same kind of adjustment that had been made, without incident, on every night since Queenstown. That particular adjustment, scheduled in 2 parts on either side of midnight, would never actually be carried out. Of everyone who sat through that service, queued for that lunch, or simply walked the deck that Sunday morning in April, not one of them could have known that this was the last ordinary stretch of daylight the Titanic's maiden voyage would have before the night that followed it.